Thanks for that. Yeah, NAVCA, we're the National Association for Voluntary and Community Action. We're the membership organisation for VAST and Hackney CVS. And I was intrigued by Jake's boast that they've now achieved the highest marks on the Quality Award, because if I know anything about Sajid, he's going to be gunning for that fairly soon. So, you know, step up to it. Step up to it, Saj. The other thing I wanted to say, just by way of introduction, sort of hearing from local government speakers this morning, you'll see from my biography, I was a councillor in Haringey for 10 years in the 90s, which is kind of next door to Hackney, and I lived in Hackney for a little while, so I know it very well. In fact, when I go there now, I've got a beard. I used to have a beard when I was a councillor. I've got a beard now, and I feel a bit naked when I wander around the streets of Hackney, because everyone, well, I'm probably a bit old to be considered a hipster anyway. But when I was a councillor in Haringey, I was on the receiving end of that first slide that Jake showed. People campaigning against cuts. I was responsible for finance. And when I think back to those days now, the scale of what I had to deal with, we had cuts year on year. For 3 years I was chair of finance. The scale of it was absolutely nothing compared to what confronts local government these days. So I think that's worth bearing in mind. And by and large, our members have good relationships right across England. We represent similar organisations, Hackney CVS and VAST, right across England, and they have very good relationships with councils, although they get a bit spiky at times around this. I think the first thing I want to say, I've been asked to talk about keeping commissioning local. One of the things we find, although I think the discussion here this morning suggests it's not the case here, when people talk about commissioning, they see it as synonymous with procurement, and they're part of the same. Procurement is part of the commissioning cycle, if you like, but it's not. The two aren't the same. I think it's vitally important, particularly when you're thinking about the involvement of local groups, and particularly smaller local groups, because I think we'd say one of the most important roles that many of you have, and it was picked up by one of the speakers this morning, is around advocating for particular communities, about being an articulate voice, particularly on behalf of the most vulnerable and disadvantaged. And that is why I think, despite the fact that we see more contracts, we see new forms of investment, it's crucially important that there is some form of grant programme to support those voice and advocacy groups. Because quite often, that's the only way in which they can be resourced. And we're talking about fairly small scale, and it might well be the kind of model that Jake was talking about, which might be rolled into something which is slightly bigger and operates across the local authority area. But I don't think there's any doubt that in some ways, the most cost-effective way of getting small amounts of money to the sorts of organisations, sounds like I'm kind of crackling up here. I'll carry on regardless. The best way of getting resources to those kinds of organisations is through a grant. It's actually a flexible way of doing it, and it's a cost-effective way of doing it. It has much lower transaction cost than a contract. That's not to say it's the solution to everything, but I think it's got to be part of the mix. I'm not quite sure what I'm doing here, so maybe it's stopped. I should say, I'm on one of those 5-2 diets, where you eat normally for 5 days, and for 2 days, a man eats under 600 calories. And today is one of my 2 days, so it could be that some of those noises are coming from my stomach. So, grants are an important part of it, and obviously they're crucial for local organisations. And I think increasingly, what we'll need to see is more integrated grant funding. We've heard from CCG, we've heard from a local authority, we've got a local police and crime commissioner. I think increasingly we'll need to see local public bodies working together to support those vital groups, those groups that actually give them the intelligence, represent people on the ground, work together to ensure that they are sustainable. But nonetheless, we're seeing an increase in contracts. They tend, and this is one of the things that concern us, which is why the model they've developed in Hackney is so reassuring, it's something we're trying to promote more widely. They tend to get bigger. So in other words, one of the things that's been almost a mantra, although I think it's changing, and I think the current government recognises it, and I think the previous government recognised it, but they didn't do much about it. There's been a tendency to make ever bigger contracts, because economies of scale are where it's at, aren't they? Well, actually, I think there's a school of thought that actually says, well, that's not necessarily the case. It might be for some things. There might, you know, if you're thinking about re-tarmacking your roads or something like that, then it probably makes sense to do it on a fairly big scale. But some of those very personalised services to people, which is what most of the things that you folks do, there might be some things that all of us need and can be done on a fairly large scale to a fairly standard specification. But there are certain things that certain communities need, people with particular conditions, where you actually need to have a real understanding of the context and the place in which they operate, and that particular community. Which is why I think it's vitally important that smaller local groups are part of the equation. One solution has been, well, let's have subcontracting. You know, we'll let a contract to a big provider, big out-of-town provider, and we'll tell them they've got to work with smaller local groups. Sometimes that can work, and it can work really, really well. But in other circumstances, all we see is that actually, because big providers tend to bid low in order to win the contract, they then end up squeezing the smaller providers. So actually, you don't get the best of both worlds. So I think eyes need to be open to that sort of thing. One of our national partners, Locality, did some work around this. They call it diseconomies of scale. They're trying to argue. They published a report middle of last year, I think, called Diseconomies of Scale, which tries to argue that in fact it's not always the case that by agglomerating, aggregating services into a bigger contract, you get the kind of economies that you might expect. And actually, some things get lost. And I just want to talk about a few of those things on the way. I think that the crucial thing in terms of funding for the sector is we've got to change the focus to talk about investment. Because I think, as we've heard, and as I've said, there's less public money around. So everyone needs to think about how they do things differently. So everything, even a grant to a local group, I suspect commissioners will increasingly think, how is this investing in the long-term sustainability of a particular service or a particular community? And how is this helping to resolve some of the key challenges we have, first and foremost, but also, in the circumstances in which many public services operate, how is it enabling us to do this more efficiently? And whether we like it or not, that's the world in which many operate. So money's tight, and I think one of the reasons why local voluntary organisations are so important at a time when money's tight is that because you know the local community, the people you work with, you're uniquely placed to identify new and emerging needs, to actually be those advocates, be the eyes and ears on the ground, to make sure commissioners understand what's going on in a particular community, how needs are changing, and how best to address them. If you like, I mean, thinking about personal budgets in relation to health and social care, being advocates for individuals, to make sure individuals get the help, the care and support they need, in a way that actually helps them to live happier, more fulfilled lives in their community, keeping costs down. Folks in Manchester, Manchester City, not Greater Manchester, Manchester City has invested in something I think is called New Economy, which is part of its regeneration arm, and they've done quite a lot of work on the cost-benefit analysis of early intervention and exactly the sort of stuff that folks like you do. They're worth looking at. Their website is worth looking at. It's certainly government ministers, civil servants are kind of watching what they're doing, and I think perhaps that kind of approach is one of the reasons I suspect why Greater Manchester's got the benefits it's got and has actually led on the devolution agenda to a large extent. And as was said earlier, that will happen. I think it will happen at a pace. It will happen differently in different places, and that will change the way in which things operate. But I think the crucial thing, as devolution, new ways of doing things roll out, the focus will be on how you sort things out locally. So it will be even more crucially important that public bodies and others invest in your capacity to do things. So why is it important? We've heard virtually everyone's talked about prevention, early intervention. Yes, it saves money, and that's great, but most of you didn't come into what you do to save the state money. Most of you do what you do because you work with a local group. You might be somebody who was who had a particular condition, who was on the receiving end of poor services for a particular reason. So you set up a charity to do something about it. So actually, we came into it. Most people who work in the voluntary sector came into it because you want to change people's lives. You want to change people's lives for the better. So actually, early intervention, prevention, should be about that first and foremost, improving people's well-being. Improving the well-being of individuals and communities, particularly those vulnerable and disadvantaged. The real opportunity for the public sector is to actually harness that in a way and invest in that in a way that helps them achieve their objectives as well, to actually lower the cost of public services. Ian Parry talked about getting it right first time, and I think that's crucially important, because if you think about the churn of people who go to A&E regularly, end up in a hospital ward, don't get out because the right care and support isn't available for them in the community. Well, how much money could you save if you actually prevented them going to A&E in the first place because they had the right care and support in the first place? So getting it right first time, I think, is crucially important. And that's not just about delivering a service, that is about listening to service users, it's about listening to their advocates, and it's about shaping services around them. And as I say, that has to be, for our way of thinking, that has to be about local. I think one of the challenges in all that is if you achieve savings in a hospital trust because you're reducing the cost of keeping people in hospital too long, how do you get that money back into prevention? And that's one of the real challenges I think we face. Because whether we like it or not, people on the street want to be sure that their grandmother, their mother or father, their elderly relative gets the care they need in hospital when they need it. So there's a real tension there between shifting resources to prevention and early intervention, but also making sure the acute services we need are there when we need them. So I'm going to wind up, and I'm happy to take questions or comments. I think there are several things that we need to focus on as a sector, and I think they really are the things that locally you're well placed to do. Integrating health and care, that's got to be a priority. As everyone said, the cost of care is escalating. We've seen it during the winter. 29 hospitals across the country in crisis. So we need to integrate that, and I think organisations like yours and others around the country are well placed to do it, and you can't do it unless there's investment in local voluntary organisations. And allied to that, investing and helping to support an ageing population remain in their homes as long as possible. And a lot of local charities around the country are working on that. And also there's the health prevention agenda. Actually, we heard about a bit of that from the speaker from one of the local clinical commissioning groups. There's a huge role for community organisations in supporting people to change their lives. I think the big challenge for public services is they're not well placed to get people to change their lives. The best way to get someone to change their lives, if they're obese, if they smoke, if they're a drug user, is actually to work with a community organisation, probably run by people who were drug users or had an alcohol problem themselves, because they can relate to them, they can get them to change their lives. So I think that's the key for the public sector, to invest in that kind of thing. I think finally, in closing, the big challenge for all of us across this whole agenda, and I think that's why local is so important, is to actually start to reduce the gap between the richest and the poorest, because actually that's what tends to create a lot of the tensions, a lot of the difficulties we're trying to tackle in society, and I think local voluntary and community organisations are particularly well placed to do that. I'm happy to take any questions. I won't be around after lunch because I've got to get back to the office for a couple of things I've got to get out of the way this afternoon. But I will be happy to listen to any questions and comments. Yeah, now. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.